to briefly play devil's advocate for a moment, hopefully to spark an interesting discussion, looking at urban fantasy possibly as not necessarily something wholly new, because we all know that doesn't happen, but something new in the sense of being reinvented. What about considering modern urban fantasy in the light of the attempt to reconcile this new world of science with the old world of wolves and elves and vampires that science was supposed to make go away but didn't? And I think I'm paraphrasing something you wrote there. But
no, I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. I have no idea. But if science isn't going to make those things go away, then we have to deal with them. But our old methods of dealing with them aren't going to work anymore because we don't have the woods. So what about urban fantasy as a way of fitting them in with science?
So you mean like instead of runes, you have cans of spray paint? Instead of runes, you have.
I guess I could jump on that one.
She got me.
There's dark places in the city.
Jim mentioned H.P. Lovecraft a little while ago, and if you go back to Lovecraft's day, the 1920s to 1930s, fantastic literature hadn't really differentiated into the various forms and subforms and subgenres and sub-subgenres that we're all familiar with today. I mean, Lovecraft, if you read almost any of his books, combined elements of fantasy, science fiction, and horror, and actually was published in Weird Tales, which was primarily a fantasy magazine, but was also published in some of the leading science fiction magazines of the day. What we regard as science fiction, fantasy, etc., didn't become really separate marketing categories again really until about the 1970s. And the point I am trying to make is,
get on with it.
Up until I think fairly recently, the form of fantasy, the subform of fantasy that kind of occupied the urban ecological niche, so to speak, was science fiction. I mean, tons of science fiction was written, over the last 70, 80 years about future urban environments or develop various, developments, possible evolutions of urbanism. And I think that was, if someone wanted to write in an urban setting, I think they just kind of tended to think in more what we would call kind of a science fiction way. But I think since what happened in the 70s was when fantasy was kind of categorized as a genre, it was categorized based upon, the Tolkien model. So everyone just sort of assumed, fantasy is rural, fantasy is medieval, etc. And so much of that got pumped out. I think that writers who wanted to write fantasy, but who wanted to do something different than what had become very run-of-the-mill, they almost had to branch out away from, your Tolkien type environments, and I think they were almost forced into your urban and suburban environments.
Just for me as an author, from a purely practical standpoint, because that's the way I approach just about everything. The reason I use this setting is because I want that element of it could happen to me for my readers. I mean, some hot tattooed Scots time traveler may want me, So, just from a practical mercenary writer standpoint, that's where I'm coming from.
I got a sword to bring you on.
And your ears don't.
Yeah, what we've been talking about is where it's come from, where it's going today. If we're looking at urban fantasy as what's happening now, urban fantasy's been happening for years. If you go back as far as the pulps, if you're going to talk about it as what's happening, a book something written in the current time with fantastic items, Doc Savage and the pulps is the beginning of urban fantasy, because at that point what was fantastic as the definition of fantasy was things you wouldn't expect to be around you. Today we expect cell phones, but Dick Tracy's watch was fantastic at that point. Those changes. So if everything is the same, if you have a character and what we're doing is taking things that aren't acceptable, with the romance books, with the paranormal romance, is the audience going to continue, is the paranormal going to continue to grow? If we're in an ocean as opposed to a wave, as the panel talked about, is that ocean continuing to grow, or is this just a tidal shift? Is paranormal really here to stay?
Yeah, I think so.
Yes, it is.
I mean, what that looks like may change, but I think in general, yeah.
I would even go all the way back to possibly Midsummer Night's Dream.
Absolutely.
Quote,
Yeah.
Shakespeare,
quote,
absolutely.
urban fantasy, because at the time, the small hamlet towns were the urban setting. And
You can go
the,
farther
the
back than
witches
that.
and queens
Anything.
and fae and everything
And
else.
actually, urban legends are based off legends.
If the axiom of people write what they know is the real axiom, that you write your scenario of what you know, and then you take other characters, put it in, you're there. Sorry.
You can go back, but Edgar Allan Poe talk about Lovecraft. Where did Lovecraft get his stuff? From Edgar Allan Poe. Okay, it's because they basically, we're not that far apart. I know Poe because I actually wrote nonfiction books and got to learn enough from the Poe Museum down in Richmond. You can go back, like they said, all the urban legends, because number one, I write nonfiction ghost books. And I did do a lot of urban legends and stuff, and that's basically legends. A lot of the legends that people did in the rural areas, like the hitchhiker, now they're doing it with the car. It's just changing over from one to the urban legend. The same legends is changing over the years to what now we, because we're living in the cities and in the small towns. So, they've been there for quite a long time.
Well, and I can definitely see where getting into small towns, or I read a book recently that was like a tourist town in coastal Maine that was modern fantasy. But is there something about the urban itself? Does the city give you something fantastic? Like, what do you get in telling a wizard story in Chicago or a vampire story in New Orleans that you wouldn't get outside of a city or outside those particular cities?
Well, I got a passing grade, which I wouldn't have gotten. Changed it to Chicago. So, but that's just me.
Well, I mean, cities are very, very powerful generators of their own mythologies. I mean, cities are kind of loci of history and tradition, and especially a city where I come from, New Orleans. I mean, you've got 300 years of history that in a lot of ways is almost as fantastical as anything anybody could come up with. I mean, I lived through Katrina, and ended up writing a fantasy novel based on the Katrina experience, and actually had a very hard time exaggerating what actually happened to make it fantastical, because what actually happened was almost, fantastical enough that I couldn't outdo it. So, but this gentleman way in the back there just had his hand up.
One of the older books of urban fantasy is one that's often overlooked even by the present, and that's by Bram Stoker, namely Dracula.
Yeah.
He brought a legendary figure into the city in order to increase the impact of the horror that figure did for all those around him. And I think that was the reason he did it, so that he could bring it up to modern times, so that everyone around who was reading the book would be looking over their shoulders and shivering at night, wondering whether or not this could actually be, as he said. And that made the book, which is somewhat poorly written, still a bestseller.
Yeah, definitely Dracula would have to be on the list of precursors of modern urban fantasy. I mean, if you look at any of the vampire stories that preceded Dracula, I mean, they were all sort of the set in distant manors, isolated little hamlets, etc. Dracula was the first vampire story, a major horror story that took place in what for its time was the biggest urban metropolis in the world.